Welcome, everyone. I'm just waiting for some of the videos to load here. And I know that people are going to be straggling in. We had quite a number of people who were interested in participating in this session. So just going to take a few minutes to do a quick introduction. Welcome, everyone. My name is Asher Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Post-Carbon Institute. Thank you all for joining us today. There's some folks on the West Coast, some folks on the East Coast, some folks in the middle of the country, some folks overseas. So whatever time it is for you all, thanks for joining us. I also want to thank the Story of Stuff and the Happiness Project for co-sponsoring this conversation with us. Really appreciate it. We only have an hour together, so I wanted to kind of dispense with some logistics before we get started. This is a very interesting and important conversation that we're hoping to have today. The question is, what will consumerism be like in the post-fossil fuel future? Before we begin, I want to give a little bit of context and then explain sort of how this conversation is going to work. First, the context. So over the last year, Post-Carbon Institute has undertaken a deep dive analysis of the challenges and opportunities in the transition to 100% renewable energy. The outcome of that analysis was just published with our friends at Island Press. A book called Our Renewable Future. You can order the book or read the entire book for free online at ourrenewablefuture.org. One of the key takeaways from our analysis was that the transition won't be a simple plug-and-play substitution, unplugging coal plants and plugging in renewable energy. It's going to require us to use energy very differently in every aspect of life. So over the coming weeks, Post-Carbon Institute is hosting a number of conversations, discussions with experts in various sectors to kind of explore questions about what that post-fossil fuel future might look like. And you can go to ourrenewablefuture.org right now and sign up for any of those discussions. Ultimately, the future we're going to create is going to be one that we co-create together. And so we're really interested in actually hearing from all of you. So if you have any questions for our panelists, there's a chat box here in the window below the video feed, and you can go ahead and type in your questions there. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But also, if you have any thoughts or ideas or inspirations, you could share those with us by either emailing orf@postcarbon.org, or you could tweet us with the hashtag renewablefuture, one word. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists very briefly. Leonard is Executive Director of Greenpeace USA and the founder of Story of Stuff project. Her video, The Story of Stuff, has been viewed over 40 million times. I probably watched it myself, at least 10 of those. If you haven't watched it, all the subsequent videos, you absolutely have to do that. That's an order. John Graaf is the co-author of the books Affluenza and What's the Economy For Anyway. He's a documentary filmmaker, has produced more than a dozen primetime national PBS specials, and has won more than 100 filmmaking awards. John's also the Executive Director of Take Back Your Time and co-founder of the Happiness Initiative. And then we've also asked Richard Heinberg, one of the co-authors of Our Renewable Future, to join us for the conversation. Richard is my colleague at the Post-Carbon Institute, where he's Senior Fellow in Residence. He's the author of 13 books on energy and sustainability issues. So without further ado, Annie, John, Richard, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. And what we're going to do is just have kind of a free-flowing conversation. I'd like to actually start with you, Richard, to maybe lay some context, tell people understand sort of the relationship between energy and fossil fuels in particular, and consumerism. So maybe you could describe the role that energy has played in the growth of modern Western consumerism for us.
Sure. In our examination of what it would take to transition to a renewable energy future, David Fidley and I often came back to an important distinction, and that's between operational energy and embodied energy. If you think about a car, the gasoline that goes in the tank or the electricity you use to charge the battery, that's operational energy. But the energy that went into manufacturing the car, extracting all the raw materials, building infrastructure like the highways that the car uses throughout its lifetime, that's embodied energy. Now, why is this important? For a variety of reasons, it became clear to us that it's going to be a lot easier to replace operational energy with renewables than it will be to replace embodied energy. It's going to be much more difficult to embody energy in infrastructure like highways built out of cement and concrete and asphalt, and consumer products than it will be to just replace our electricity supply. Which brings us to the subject of consumerism. And I have to say, my understanding of consumerism really dates back in some ways to my reading of the book Captains of Consciousness by Stuart Ewan back in the 1990s. It was actually written in the 70s. It's a history of the advertising industry. And Ewan makes it clear that consumerism didn't just happen by accident. It was a logical and deliberate construct on the part of the economic elites of the early 20th century who were responding to a problem at the time. And the problem was one of overproduction. With cheap fossil energy, it was possible to produce so much stuff so fast in powered assembly lines that the economy couldn't soak up all of this production. So the problem was solved with advertising, consumer credit, and a reorientation of both the economy and also government policy around the idea that personal consumption, people buying more and more stuff, should be the organizing principle for the entire economy. So I think it's important that we start by understanding that consumerism is this systemically interlinked set of institutions rather than just, a kind of greedy proclivity on the part of some people. How consumerism works today in energy terms is also important to understand. And we could summarize that very simplistically as China burning lots of cheap coal to make consumer goods that get shipped via oil-burning container ships to American households and stores. So the greenhouse gases are attributed to the Chinese who are burning all that coal, or they're not counted at all in terms of the transport shipping, which gives us a very, very skewed understanding of what our current energy and climate situation really is, and its links to consumerism. So maybe that's enough for me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what the both of you have to say about this.
Thanks, Richard. Andy, maybe you could talk, and Richard just touched upon this really briefly a second ago, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the environmental costs that are associated with modern consumption and consumerism.
Sure. Well, that's interesting. You just said modern consumption and consumerism. I think that those are two very different, and we should be clear about what we're talking about, because consumption is using stuff, and we all need to consume some things to live, and consumption by itself is not a problem. Consumerism is a particular kind of consumption. It's sort of, as Richard said, it's an organizing principle of our take, make, waste economy. It's an ideology, it's a set of beliefs, it's a particular relationship to consumption that is totally hyped up with the availability of cheap fossil fuel energies. And it's a relationship to consumption through which we're trying to find our meaning or our purpose in life, or demonstrating our value, or codifying our relationships to others, all through consumption. So I just want to sort of highlight that difference between consumption and consumerism, which is this really out of control set of ideological and economic organizing principles, which I often talk about the economy as the take, make, waste economy. The whole economy now is based, most of the economy right now is based on taking resources from the planet, using them, chucking them, and then taking more resources. And that is, of course, linked to massive environmental problems. I think about the portfolio that Greenpeace works on, whether it's that the oceans are being completely cleared of fish and are now turning into dead zones in many places with more pieces of plastic pollution than fish. Whether it's the rainforests around the world, in the Amazon, in Congo, in Indonesia, being clear cut, whether it's toxic pollution, pretty much every environmental problem out there is driven by and exacerbated and amplified by this excessive consumerism. The one that is most obvious and visible to us every day is waste. And when people think of the link between consumerism and environment, we often think about the waste that we create. And we create an absolutely disgusting amount of waste in this country. It's about 4.5 pounds of waste that we each throw away each day. But just like there's operational energy and embedded energy, there's also sort of the daily waste production, and there's the embedded waste production, which is all the waste created to make that 4.5 pounds of stuff that we're throwing away. And that's much, much, much more. The waste that we see coming out of our household is the tip of the iceberg compared to the amount of waste created in mining, drilling, extracting, transporting, processing, all of that stuff, which we're then going to briefly use and throw away. And all of that is made possible by the abundance of cheap energy. So it's really an illusion that this is even remotely sustainable.
Thanks, Amy. And then, John, maybe you could share a little bit about your views on, I guess, what I would call the social costs of American-style consumerism, and also, I guess, some of the benefits of that.
Well, I think we can obviously see some benefits to consumerism for people up to a point. We look at gross domestic product. That's the way we measure our success as consumer societies. And when the GDP goes up, the grosser it gets, the better off we're supposed to be. And that works for a while. When countries are very, very poor, rising GDPs can bring a great increase in well-being and in personal satisfaction. But after a while, and that's found to be at somewhere around a level of $10,000 a year US in most places, that whole thing flattens off. And it's not that people don't get any more satisfaction at all. They do, but it's so flat that they pay enormous costs for those increases, and they could probably be a lot more satisfied without those increases by doing things in a different way. What are some of the costs we pay? Well, the biggest cost in my book we pay socially for constantly feeling like we have to grow and we have to consume and we have to keep this going is overwork in a massive way. We have not had a lessening of the work week in the United States since the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And in fact, according to Juliet Shore and many other experts, we're actually working longer hours today than we were in the 1960s and the 1970s. And the cost of this is very, very high because that time spent at work is time not being spent in relationship and connection with friends, with others, in time spent in building a community and volunteering and taking care of that community, in time spent in the natural world and appreciating the natural world, all things that we know make us more satisfied and happier with our lives. And so the result is that we see increases, sharp increases in loneliness, particularly as people age in the United States. We now found, AARP and Time Magazine did a study that found that in the decade between 2000 and 2010 alone, the percentage of older Americans over 45, who could be called chronically lonely in terms of their expression of how lonely they were, of how they missed out on connection with others, increased in that decade alone from 20 to 35% of that population. Now that is an enormous tragedy, not only for those people who are lonely, but it's a huge impact on our healthcare system because it's precisely those older and chronically lonely people who are suffering the kind of diseases that we pay for the most in our healthcare economy. We are spending twice as much money in this consumer-obsessed society that the United States is on healthcare than people in virtually any other wealthy country, with arguably the worst results. We have the lowest life expectancy among rich countries. We have the highest infant mortality. We have the greatest amounts of stress. We have the highest amounts of anxiety and depression. We are now using some 60% of the world's antidepressants. So one could go on, but there are other factors socially too, in that as all of society becomes marketized, it becomes harder to have a social commons in which we can find things that are enjoyable that we do together and with each other. The Italian economist Stefano Bartolini looks at the whole idea of GDP and says that where we see rapid GDP growth in already rich countries, this is a sign of decay in the social system, not of dynamism. So, for example, this rapid rise in GDP results in overwork, resulting in disconnection and loneliness, resulting in destruction of the environmental commons that we have. What do? We sell those things back to people through the market. So you're lonesome, get this car and you'll have lots of friends. You don't have any contact with nature because we've destroyed and bulldozed that nature and put up high rises and fly to a tropical paradise and spend some time in a pristine environment for 4 days. All of that looks great on the books because GDP rises, but all of that, in fact, is a symptom of the decay of the social order in the society. And I think that's as important as the obvious environmental damage that we are doing by all of this, which Annie very correctly pointed out.
Thank you for that. So we talked a little bit already about some of the environmental impacts, and as Annie mentioned, the rampant consumerist economic system that we've developed is unsustainable for a lot of reasons. And then John, you talked about some of the social costs and the impacts on society and human beings as individuals as a result of kind of this frenetic consumerism that we've created. I do want to get back to this sort of question about the relationship of energy and the transition towards renewable energy. So, because there could be lots of reasons why we might want to shift or need to shift away from this consumerism, consumer-based economic system that have nothing to do with our energy inputs. But I'm curious to know from you guys, and love to hear from all three of you on this question. When you try to imagine a future where there aren't those fossil fuel inputs into the system, what comes to mind? What questions come to mind? What vision comes to mind in terms of, our production of products, of, are there going to be any changes to that system just based upon the relationship and role that fossil fuels have played, and maybe some of the differences with renewable energy? So I'll open up to any of you who might have a thought about that question.
We're all so polite. No one wants to go first.
Yeah, jump in, Annie.
I'll jump in. Well, first I want to say it's not really a question of if we're going to have to figure out how to meet our needs beyond fossil fuels, but how we're going to have to figure out how to meet our needs beyond fossil fuels. I mean, many decades, John and Juliet Shore and others have argued about the problems with consumerism, which are so huge. Consumerism is trashing the planet, and we're trashing each other, and we're not even having fun. So clearly we need a different system. But we're beyond the point where we need to sort of emotionally or intellectually or factually argue that consumerism is not the right way. It's just physically not possible to sustain this level of consumerism because we are bumping up against the planet's limits. Scientists now say that 80% of known fossil fuel reserves need to stay underground if we want to avoid absolute climate catastrophe, which I would argue is something we would like to avoid. So the question is not if we are going to change how we consume, but how we are going to change how we consume. And I really feel like we are at a crossroads while we do still have fossil fuels to burn, is we can either dig our heels in and say the American way of life is non-negotiable and just absolutely be in denial and compartmentalize and keep going, or we can say, let's be proactive about this. Let's be strategic about it. Let's use the fossil fuels that we can still use in an intelligent way. We are going to change either by design or by disaster. But either way, we are going to change. And if we are proactive and change by design, it's still going to be hard. There's lots of things that are going to be hard. And as John was saying, lots of things that are going to be better, too. once we get through this transition. But if we do be proactive and change by design, we can be more strategic, more just, less violent. I mean, if we don't get going to figure out really quickly how to have a sustainable level of consumption fueled by sustainable energy, it's just going to get really ugly.
If I talk about what this might look like, I think we all of us know that we're going to need to be a lot more local. We're going to have a lot more localization. We simply cannot waste the energy of the world, the fossil fuels and other energy of the world, transporting, for instance, back and forth across the ocean, huge numbers of automobiles from one country that makes automobiles to another country that makes automobiles. And you can use that for a whole lot of goods. We need to be making things locally and using them, and obviously we need to make a lot less automobiles, and that also means we need to travel differently. We need to walk and bike and use public transportation. This society will look very different. It will be slower. It will be quieter. It will be more involvement with growing your own food. But you can't just do that given the way we are today. Many people simply find that they don't have time to ride a bike or walk to work. They don't have time to grow their own foods or pay a whole lot of attention to how they cook their foods. That's why we have fast food. That's why we have that stuff, because we live in this hugely time-pressed environment, which is really about working endless hours in order to consume more. So in my view, the single most important step that we can take to move toward the kind of society we need is to start trading our gains in productivity and technological gains for time instead of money and stuff. We need to shorten the work week. We need all those kinds of time so that people actually have time to do the things that we need to do. We find the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, for example, has found that if you move to a 30-hour work week, as some cities in Sweden are doing, you will cut greenhouse gas emissions by some 20 to 30% almost automatically by the things that both the embodied energy and the transportation and the other kinds of things that are going on. You will reduce not only carbon footprints, but ecological footprints as you're consuming less. And the people who work a 30-hour week, according to the Swedish EPA studies, are more satisfied with their lives than those who are working 40 or 50 hours. This is a win-win. This isn't about sacrifice. The sacrifice is now we are sacrificing the time to live.
Thanks, John. Annie, you touched a little bit about sort of the question being how we actually manage this transition, how we go about doing this, and if we're proactive and we're wise about using the resources we have versus letting these limits and crises sort of shape the future for us. There's this question, and one of the audience members asked this question sort of about justice in the international context, because we here in the West consume far more per capita than other people do, and meanwhile and Richard talked about this in his early comments about how the consumerist system has a lot of components to it, which have to do with the bottom lines of businesses that have a lot of wealth and power, policy and advertising. And here we are, we've been globalizing the promotion of this consumerist lifestyle. So how do we deal with this question where we, as John is talking about, are seeing the costs maybe starting to significantly outweigh the benefits of a consumerist society and lifestyle? Whereas other people around the world are hoping to get a little bit of what we've been, advertising to them and showing them in movies and television. So how do we deal with that international conversation?
Well, I want to say folks around the world that are hoping to get a little bit of an advertising is fair enough. It's easy for us to say we consume too much, but if you don't have a roof or access to education or healthcare or a second pair of shoes or even a first pair of shoes, you should consume more. You should have more. And so that's why a primary value that all of us have to absolutely be committed to is equity. If we do not absolutely embrace equity in every single thing we do, we will end up with a kind of resource apartheid where those who can afford it have Nissan Leafs and solar panels and local organic food, and many, many people will not have enough for even basic decency. So equity has got to be at the core of how we think about this. I live in Berkeley, and I saw a bumper sticker. We're famous for our bumper stickers in Berkeley recently that said, less and local. And, I thought, less for some. Some of us on the way over consuming end of the spectrum, absolutely less. But some people in our own country, as well as internationally, rightfully need more to even be able to reach their full potential. Others are consuming so much it's undermining our full potential. But that's why equity has to be core. And that's why this is such a profound and threatening thought. Because if we accept that the planet has ecological limits and that the economy must act within the planet's ecological limits, then there is a limit to growth. If we accept that we cannot have indefinite economic growth, there is only one way to get more stuff to the people who actually need it, and that's to share more, or as some people say, to redistribute. And that's why talking about equity in the lens, in the arena of consumption, really is going to the heart of our capitalist economic system. It really is talking about, rather than focusing on individual profit and growth maximization, we're going to talk about cooperating, sharing, and redistributing. It's the only ethical and physically possible way to go forward.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that I absolutely agree with Annie on all of that, and I certainly, when I was talking about less work, I do believe that we need to work less, but I do believe also that the people on the bottom need to be paid considerably more for the work that they are doing. We need to raise the minimum wage. That's a minimum, and we need to. If we have growth, we have to ask what should grow and what should shrink. And what needs to grow is decent homes for people who have a home, being able to meet healthcare needs and those kind of things. But the pure consumerism of more and more stuff, luxury goods and so forth, that really needs to shrink if we're to have a future. So inequality is a huge driver of this problem because the people who don't have naturally want, and that's understandable. And so we have a situation where CEOs are making 400 times what the average worker makes. That is intolerable. That is simply unacceptable. And that is driving the model for how we all ought to consume. It's crazy.
Yeah, one thing I guess I'm getting out of this conversation, which I think was evident before, but it's a strong reminder, is that you can't look at any particular sector of the economy or human society without recognizing its connections to every other piece, right? So here we're talking about the larger economic system. We're talking about justice issues. Consumerism is connected to all those things, energy, environmental impacts. When we try to think about the role that individuals play, we're often told that we need to be good consumers, right? And we're described as consumers, which I would say is maybe one of the first things that we need to get rid of is redefining who we are as people. But what do you guys imagine the role is of individuals, the people who have taken the time to participate in a conversation like this? Means that they're already concerned about these issues. So what role can those of us who care about these things play? And how do we, who exist in a modern society, here we are using our modern computers to talk to one another. Most of us have smartphones. We are bought into a consumer, not just a consumer culture, but we're dependent upon products themselves that we actually don't have much say in some ways about, controlling. Like, for example, Apple just said that they won't make it possible for people to repair their phones, really, right? So there's such a planned obsolescence that's built into the consumer system right now. So what can individuals do? Is it about buying less? Is it about making different consumer choices? How can people support the transition to something that's more sustainable and just now?
Go for it, Annie.
Well, you guys letting me go first here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Richard, you go. I'll go after you, Richard.
I was just going to bring up the subject of planned obsolescence because it really is one of the main strategies of consumerism as a systemic program of modern industrial society. And clearly, as we move away from consumerism, we're going to have to replace that with almost the opposite strategy of, planned reuse and repair, a reorientation of manufacturing around quality, and redesign of stuff, so that we basically just stop manufacturing stuff that's ephemeral, that nobody really needs, and things that people really do need, we need to make in such a way that they can be repaired, reused, and recycled almost indefinitely with minimal inputs of new materials mined from the earth. So how do we, your question, Asher, is very apt. How do we as citizens promote that kind of transformation in the manufacturing sector? And we have limited power because, of course, you and I are not CEOs of Apple or other big manufacturing companies, but when we do buy things, I think it's important that we ask ourselves, do I really need that thing, first of all? And second, is this something that can be reused, recycled, and repaired? And third, how is it being produced now? Where is it being made? Under what conditions? Are there plans on the part of the manufacturers for dealing with this thing if and when it's no longer useful? So those are some thoughts.
I can jump in just on following up on what you had to say, Richard. Vicki Robin, who wrote the book Your Money or Your Life and has focused on a lot of these issues, how do we get people to be more frugal, consume less, consume more wisely, suggested at one time the whole idea of a credit card condom or a credit card prophylactic, which is basically an envelope that you stick your credit card into. And on the outside of the envelope, it has several questions, and they are precisely the questions that you raised, Richard. Are these things renewable or recycled? Could I borrow them from someone else? Do I really need this? What does this cost the earth? Where is it made? And so forth. And so you take out this, and when you read these questions and you think about them, you can practice safe shopping. As we say, safe in the sense not only of ourselves but also of the planet.
Amy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about what people can do because after I made this Story of Stuff film, I got over 1 million emails from people saying, what can I do? And I was really torn because on the one hand, individual shopping decisions aren't really a great leverage point. But on the other hand, I couldn't really tell each of these people, go transform the global economy to be sustainable and just. So I thought a lot about what individuals can really do. And I've come up with 4 leverage points where I think we need to be working, or 4 fronts. And different people are attracted to different ones. So you should do whichever one most appeals to you. But those 4 things I think we need to do. Number 1 is we need to fight the bad stuff. There are currently things from, coal mining on public lands to garbage incinerators. There are lots of dirty, destructive technologies and processes and products that are undermining equity and well-being. So we need to fight the bad. Second, we need to build the good. We can't expect people to want to jump off this consumer ship, even though it's sinking, I will point that out, to a new ship, unless we can offer them a better solution. And the good thing is we can. So whether it's building cooperatives, setting up sharing centers. In my neighborhood, we have the public library system has a tool lending library. So anytime I need a power drill or anything, I don't have to go buy it and then keep it in my garage stored there for years. I can just go borrow it. Setting up sharing, working for workers' rights and collective bargaining. I mean, there's so many ways that we can both fight the bad and build the good. The third thing we need to be doing is changing the rules. Right now, the rules of our system are set up to facilitate and reward trashing the planet. And it's not just by coincidence that people drive instead of take bikes. Like, there's no bike lanes. There's subsidies for highways. There's actual rules that create the kind of society we want or don't want. So things like, let's ban toxic chemicals out of consumer products. Isn't it crazy that our children's pajamas have chemicals that stunt neurological development? It's crazy. We need to ban toxic chemicals. We need to mandate that products be made safely, and as Richard said, that they can be repaired and reused and recycled. We need to ban advertising in public spaces. You know, we're one of the few countries in the world that allows commercial advertising in schools and targeting children. It's obscene. We need to move government subsidies away from the old dinosaur fossil fuel economy to a new, clean, sustainable, just economy. We need to start charging for externalized costs. There's so many ways we can change the rules to facilitate the kind of society that we want. And then the fourth thing, after we fight the bad, build the good, change the rules, perhaps the most important one is change the story. Our entire system is propped up by a sort of societal narrative about the role of consumerism, and that the role of us in a society, that we are consumers, and the way that we demonstrate our self-worth and define our relationships to each other is through consumption, and that more stuff will make us happy. Every one of us every day has an opportunity to live, to tell a different story and live another story. We can, as John says, choose time over more stuff. We can redefine our family holidays and traditions around time together instead of around stuff. We can invest in the commons and utilize the commons, take back our physical landscape rather than always participate in the market economy. There are so many ways that we can tell and live a different story. And the truth is, once we get through this transition, it's a way better story. It's a way more fun way to live, which is very lucky. We're not saying come join us and we'll be martyrs forever. We're saying come join us and we will have a much richer sense of community, better health, better food, stronger families, and figure out how to live on the family together. So those are the four fronts that I see where individuals can push.
Thanks, that's great. It seems to me, I think about those four, that and not in isolation or solely, but the local context seems like a perfect way of being able to work on all four of those things potentially, right? Changing the rules locally, thinking about the story that we're telling locally and being connected with people locally. So are there any examples that any of you have come across either here in the US or from abroad, examples of either how communities or innovative businesses are exemplifying some of the things that you're talking about?
Well, I can talk about a couple of things. I mentioned Sweden's EPA looking into the whole idea of a 6-hour day. It's been better for people both socially and for health and for well-being and also environmentally. So several cities in Sweden are moving in various ways in that direction, led often by businesses who are making a choice to go to a 6-hour day. And we're seeing that in the United States as well. And what they're finding is that people are healthier and happier, and they're quite productive when they're there, but being so productive is not necessarily the goal, as we've talked about. The Netherlands has a great policy that's called the Hours Adjustment Act, in which you can go to your employer and you can say, I want to work less. I want to work 3 days a week instead of 5 or 4 days. And unless that employer can show that this would create a real financial hardship for the firm, the employer is required to grant you that request. Now, you'll make a little less money, you'll consume a little less, but you will have more time to do the things that you want to do. Your benefits will be prorated, and you keep your health care because in every other sane country outside the United States, universal health care is simply a right that people have. So how do the Dutch use that? Well, they use that to work more part-time than anybody on earth, the highest number of part-time workers, and to spend time doing other kinds of things with each other, with their children, and so forth. As a result, UNICEF and the OECD find that Dutch children are not only the happiest in the world, but the most well-off in a number of cases. Their parents are the least stressed. They are the happiest. So what we're seeing is that many Dutch people are making a choice, and it's a consumer society, no question, but they're making a choice to consume less and work less in order to live more, and it's paying off for them.
Richard, any
Yeah,
examples that particularly inspire you?
I think there's examples everywhere you look. You know, if there weren't so many examples, it'd be really depressing to get out of bed in the morning because the latest science about climate, as well as the latest data about inequality, are so grim. But the thing that gives me hope every day is literally all over the world, people are making change, whether it's local, nationally, or internationally. I've been looking a lot at companies that are making big change. I think Patagonia is doing some really cool work around challenging consumerism and making what they call worn wear or used stuff cool. If we could make used stuff with patches and mending cool instead of always buying new stuff, that's one of those kind of sort of mindset shifts that could help challenge this obsessive consumerism. There's a company called Interface Carpets that's a huge multinational carpet company, the biggest commercial carpet manufacturer in the world. They didn't like the fact that their business model was based on selling carpets to be used up quickly and ripped out and thrown away and replaced. So they've been experimenting with leasing as a fundamentally different business model than selling. Imagine if you leased stuff instead of purchased it, then the manufacturer would have a built-in incentive to make it as long-lasting as possible so they can just keep getting their monthly fee. So there's a lot of companies experimenting with different paradigms about consumerism and different models. There's stuff happening in terms of waste all around the world that's great. Things like mandated composting, which is such a no-brainer. If I was queen of the world tomorrow, the first thing I would say is everyone has to compost. That is such a simple way to combat climate change and reduce our waste flow. The Philippines government has banned garbage incineration, which is a really important sort of Achilles heel of this consumerism system. Garbage incinerators are gigantic machines that burn all the stuff that we're throwing away. So they make it, quote, disappear. It doesn't really disappear. It goes into the toxic ash. But it provides an easy out. It sort of hides the fact that we're producing such an unsustainable amount of waste. So that's really exciting to see countries actually say there's no more garbage incineration. One thing that I see happening on the national level in the US that I think is really important, and I noticed some of the commenters asked about this, is it's very hard to promote solutions when our government has been so captured by industrial interests, especially the fossil fuel interests. And so I have increasingly realized that getting a functioning democracy is a precondition for creating a sustainable and just economy. And so one of the things that we all have to work on, whether our expertise is energy or consumerism or education or healthcare, anything, one of the things we've got to do is reduce the influence of money in politics. So I've been feeling extremely hopeful by this movement that is growing across the country that includes workers and environmentalists and faith-based groups and civil rights groups that are all saying that we have to fix our democracy because a functioning democracy is a precondition to the changes that we know are needed and necessary.
Great point. I just add one other example, and that's in the area of consumer electronics, which is, when we were doing our energy analysis of the transition to renewables, that was one of the sticking points we found, trying to imagine how to produce consumer electronics without fossil fuels. And ultimately, there's really not a great answer there. But the closest we were able to come is imagining, like on your 18th birthday, you get a smartphone that's almost infinitely repairable, and you keep it for the rest of your life, and it gets updated and changed in various ways. But you never think about just throwing it away. And there is a company called Fairphone in Europe that's sort of trying to do that. At least they're making some efforts in that direction. It's certainly not a full solution, but at least the problem is being acknowledged, and some people are thinking about it.
One thing we really do need to do, in some ways you get what you measure, and you get what you consider important, and what we measure here is this thing called GDP. Around the world, people are starting to look at some different measurements. The OECD has a Better Life Index. You can look at all the data they've gathered around the whole of life, and that everything from environmental data to social data and so forth. You look at their report, How's Life 2015. The little country of Bhutan, which I had the great joy of visiting 3 years ago, has been a leader in that with its ideas of promoting a concept called gross national happiness rather than GDP, and actually taking a lot of steps to figure out how to do that. In the United States and a number of states now, we now have genuine progress indicators, which give us much more sense of holistically how we are doing as societies than this constant focus on the quarterly GDP. So I think we all ought to encourage those things, and I absolutely agree with the other points that Annie and Richard have made.
How familiar are you guys with the idea of extended producer responsibility? And do you feel like that, in terms of expectations of producers of products, do you feel like that's been an effective strategy? And do you see an upside to it? What are your thoughts?
So the idea of extended producer responsibility means that the companies that make stuff are responsible for it at the end of its life. So when I was going to say VCR, but I guess nobody has a VCR anymore. When your phone breaks, when your shoes get worn out, whenever something is broken, that rather than just throwing it out in the garbage, the problem with just throwing it out in the garbage is not only is it waste, but then you're actually externalizing the cost of that crappy design because the city now has to use public money to go pick this up. So rather than dumping the disposal of these often difficult to handle materials into the public sector, return it back to the company that made it. The idea with this is that it would spur better design. If Apple knew that it had to take back all its phones, it might use only one plastic resin so that they were easier to recycle. They might make it easier to disassemble and repair. They might remove all the remnants of the toxic chemicals. They actually have done a good job on removing a lot of the toxic chemicals, but there's still a lot of toxic chemicals and a lot of electronics. So that was the idea, was to force producers to make better decisions at the front end. I still think it's a good idea. It has not yielded the results that those of us who were early adopters of this had hoped yet, but I still think there's a lot of potential, and it really is an embodiment of the polluter pays principle. It's the right thing to do. You know, if Dell Computers or Panasonic or whoever wants to make poorly designed, toxic-containing, easily breakable, superfluous pieces of crap, it should be their responsibility to deal with it rather than our municipal government, who could be using that money for building bike lanes and school gardens.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, you know, young people are, I sound like an old fogey saying this, young people are coming into a world as adults that is already being buffeted by climate change and is going to get worse. They see issues with our democracy. They don't see a lot of necessarily economic opportunity. They're burdened by debt. They're also, and I'm generalizing here, right? They're also very technologically savvy, very connected to consumer products in that way. And if we're trying to make a shift or need to make a shift from a consumer economy to a conserver economy, as Richard likes to say, you know, what would your advice be to young people? You know, where can they either, you know, make a difference as individuals or see opportunities for them in terms of the career in this huge transition that we're undergoing, which is an energy transition, but it's a larger transition as well. Any thoughts about that?
This may be slightly off the subject, but one thing I think we need to say more to younger people is to get outside. We've seen a situation where, you know, kids today are spending only about a third as much time, unstructured time outdoors as they were just a generation ago. This is having kind of enormous effects. We need to understand the value, and there's a great book that Jay Griffiths wrote called The Country Called Childhood, about just how important it is for kids' sense of satisfaction and well-being to get outdoors, spend a lot of time in nature, spend time in free play that's not all set up and a game that somebody else completely organized for you, that those kids end up being happier, that they end up having being much less interested in consumer culture and the kind of things that consumer culture requires. I think on this year, the 100th anniversary of the National Park System, which some have called America's best idea, we need to have another focus about just how important it is to get out in the natural world and appreciate it, because people who don't experience that don't care about the environment in the same way, I don't think.
I agree. It's hard to care about and love what you don't know, and so we do need to know the natural environment. I speak at a lot of colleges, and it's sobering to speak to young people today because they are graduating with often hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loan, which is just crushing. And they ask my advice. I have two pieces of advice. One is I get that they have student loans and it's hard to avoid that. Don't get consumer credit card debt. Do everything you can to avoid consumer credit card debt. Now, sometimes you have to use credit cards for food or school. I get that. Except for those, do not get consumer credit card debt. If you get trapped in consumer credit card debt, it is like being a bonded laborer for life. And the choices available to you as you enter the world as an adult are just severely limited because you have to pay your credit card master. So really avoid getting sucked into that whole narrative about it is through consumerism that we demonstrate our value, because you'll just be much more free. I remember when I graduated from graduate school and I lived in a group house with a bunch of environmental activists, and we got our furniture on the street and we made lots of pasta and rice meals. And I worked for an organization that paid, actually Greenpeace, that paid me pennies, but I loved my life. And I would sometimes visit friends who had taken much higher paid jobs, and I would visit their apartments and they had way nicer furniture and way nicer stereos and cars. And I would sometimes think, am I making the right choice here? And then I went back a year later and they hated their jobs, but they couldn't leave because they had these mortgages and these payments and they were stuck. And I said, don't get stuck. Don't give away your freedom. So that's my first piece of advice. And my second piece of advice is it's time for a political revolution. I mean, we are literally at the cusp of ecological collapse. And what are people doing is they're going shopping. It is time for massive, widespread non-cooperation. The current economic system that is so fueled by consumerism and cheap fossil fuel and kept in place by this oligarchy that controls the government, it is leading us to massive environmental collapse. We need massive non-cooperation. Take nonviolent civil disobedience training. Fill the streets. The French students fill the streets when tuition goes up 2%. I just went on a college tour with my daughter and learned what current tuitions are. It's like we should be filling the streets to demand that our leaders lead, to get corporate interests out of our government, and to start investing in a clean energy economy that we know is possible. There's no point in doing it later because there will be no later if we do not really rise up now.
And the nonsense that we can't afford some of these things like free college education so that people aren't straddled by debt and aren't having to take the most high-paying jobs and so forth. It's just crazy. In 1964, I went to, see how ancient I am, I went to the University of California at Berkeley for free. And a few years later, I went to the University of Wisconsin for $300 a semester. Still not a lot of money. That was a time in which this economy was producing a third as much stuff, a third as much wealth as it does today, and we could make education free for people. Don't let them tell you that that can't be done. As far as a political revolution, I think young people are responding to Sanders' call for free education and many things, and I think that is an important place to go.
You know, it's true that the interests that benefit from the current business as usual system, they have more money than us. Absolutely, they have more money, but we have more people. If you look at the spectrum of American society, the vast majority of people actually want the earth to be able to continue to sustain human life. The vast majority of people want their babies born without toxic chemicals already in their blood. The vast majority of people share these values. Our goal is to move them from sedate consumers to active citizens working together for change. If we can do that, we can take back this country. We can build the kind of economy and society that not only will allow us to continue living, but is a much, much more satisfying, joyous way to live. If we are active, so that is really what we have to do. There's way more of us than them. So we can take it back.
My friend David Brower, the late David Brower, the great environmentalist, used to do a thing he called his sermon, in which he compressed the age of the Earth, 4.6 billion years, into a single week. And when you do that, you find that human beings don't even appear on the planet until 3 seconds before midnight on the final night. The Industrial Revolution does not occur until a quarter of a second before midnight on the very last night, And this consumer society that we've been talking about only exists for the last 1/100th of a second of our time on Earth, if that time is a week. In that 1/100th of a second, Brower said, we have managed to cut our fossil fuels, our forests, our soils, our oceans, and who knows what else by at least a half, and we have seriously changed the climate. There are people, he went on to say, who believe that what we've been doing for that last 1/100th of a second can go on indefinitely. They're considered reasonable, normal, ordinary people. In fact, they run our governments, they run our corporations, but they are stark, raving mad. We can't go on like this.
That's great.
Well said. Well said. I'm seeing a lot of comments from people who understandably are very focused on what's happening in terms of the political system right now and the general election. And one of the worries I have is that there's that balance between finding a campaign, a thing to focus on, and feeling like you could see it through to the finish line, against the recognition that these are systemic issues that we're dealing with, and there are a lot of fronts for it. And I loved what you said earlier, Annie, about the sort of like four ways, for general buckets to get involved in. And we need people pursuing all of them, and we need people to be involved in all kinds of different sorts of fronts, And so what would be your advice to people who, is it better to sort of think about focusing on the thing that you're the most passionate about? It's an immediate, cause that you have. Is it better to pace yourself and sort of like spread your energies around a number of different issues because these are systemic? How have you guys been able, each of you, been doing work to try to better our planet and lives of people for a while now? I won't say how long. So how do you maintain that yourselves? And what has been your strategy, and how do you recuperate? How do you keep your own, sanity and your motivation moving forward? So maybe I can hear from each of you about that.
John already dated himself by saying his college tuition was $300 because I think that one in a textbook today. So, okay, one of the great things about such an all-pervasive problem is that there's an almost infinite number of ways to get involved. So people don't even have to do something boring. This is not about doing your boring civic duty and sitting through like boring meetings. You can actually find lots and lots of ways to get involved that are fun and that provide those very things that most make us happy. This is what's so cool about getting involved for making change, is it makes you happy. Scientists have figured out the things that really contribute the most to our happiness and well-being, and John mentioned them. They are things like having a strong social fabric and community, having a sense of purpose and meaning beyond yourself, working with others towards shared goals. So the cool thing is that taking back our country, taking back our government, building a fair and sustainable economy provides all those things that most make us happy. So why would you not want to come to this party? It's going to be so good. So I'd say people should just try different things. There's lots of different ways to be involved. Some people want to chain themselves to a train track to stop an oil train from getting by. Other people want to provide pro bono legal assistance for the people who did that. Other people want to babysit the kids of the people who did that. Other people might want to make beautiful artwork and inspiring songs. There are literally as many ways to get involved as there are people, and they all help. And I think you should do the thing that most excites you, because then it is a joy rather than a burden. The one thing that I will say is important is to find other people to work with. When you look at the history of social movements and what were the defining characteristics about people who really stuck with it, it's if they had friends and a community involved. And there are so many organizations, locally, nationally, internationally. Reach out, search online, ask your local church, ask your local community, find student groups, find other people to connect with. And then not only will you have a peer group so that your voices are stronger, but you'll also be growing your community.
Thanks, Annie. Richard, John?
John, why don't you go, because we're practically at time.
Well, I couldn't in any way remotely put it nearly as well as Annie just put it. So I want to second everything that she said. In the short run, I do think it is important to stop a very dangerous trend in this country. We clearly have a candidate for president who could take us way back in the Dark Ages, who claims with others of his party that climate change is a hoax, who claims that we need to get more fossil fuels rather than fewer out of the ground and so forth. We have to stop that. That requires attention and energy. But it is not the only thing. We have lots of other things to do, and a lot of them can be a lot more fun than just, stopping disaster. So thanks to, it's such an honor to be involved here, and thanks to the great work of the Post Carbon Institute for what you're doing, and Greenpeace and all of you in many ways.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. Richard, any thoughts from you?
Oh, no, I feel like I'm actually, all of us here on whose faces are on the screen are really lucky, I think, to be able to have as our work things that, ways of contributing, and it's so I feel very fortunate in that regard, and when I'm not working, I try to create as much beauty in the world as I can through music or art or being in nature and gardening. And I think that, psychologically, that's really important for us at this particular time in history, to not just focus on the things that are going very, very wrong, but also to focus specifically on creating something beautiful.
All right, well, we're just about at time. I want to thank all of you. Really appreciate it, Annie, Richard, and John, and thank everybody who participated in this call. I know a lot of folks had comments and questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. We are going to be putting up this recording later, and I hope that you could share this with folks. And I want to thank everybody who is engaged in these issues and cares about these issues. This is, as Richard said, those of us who are working in the space, sometimes it feels like a Sisyphean task, but most of the time, at least for me, it feels like an honor and a privilege to be able to work on this. Yeah. There's no more important cause than the cause of trying to get society and the planet in alignment and in a place where it could thrive sustainably and equitably. We have our work cut out for us, and so I want to invite folks. For us, the renewable energy transition is not a choice. It's going to happen one way or the other. It presents us with lots of opportunities to get involved. How we manage the transition, how courageous and honest we are about what it requires, is going to make, I think, a really big difference. How we engage as individuals, how we engage collectively, is going to make an enormous difference. And that really does start with having conversations, I think, with people, with recognizing what's at stake, what matters to us, with building connections with other people, with getting involved. And so I do want to invite folks to participate in the future conversations we're going to have. We're having discussions to look at sort of what the built environment might look like in 100% renewable energy future, what the food system looks like, what the economy looks like, what justice looks like, what technology looks like. There are all kinds of questions, I think, that we need to be asking ourselves. So this is just an invitation to be thinking about this stuff and engaging with other people. So hopefully you can keep this conversation going with folks that you know and join us for future conversations we host. So thank you again, Annie and Richard and John, and we're going to end the session now. Take care, everybody.